Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, an ongoing inquiry into America's origins and its evolution. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. And now, here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I want to remember to add that because as we move towards the development of our own website and access to it, we want to make sure that we use our full title. So again, we are the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And it is a pleasure to be with you today, as it always is. I welcome you to the program. I welcome you to another week. And before I begin, get into today's program and then totally forget to do this, let me alert you, and I'll try to remember to do this again, that we're going to be moving to an hour earlier start beginning tomorrow. We're going to try to do Eastern 3 to 5 rather than 4 to 6. For a number of reasons, but one of the main ones is that the 6 o'clock is creating conflict after conflict for me in terms of scheduling. So, and we think that it would be much more accessible, the program itself, in the 3 to 5 slot. So beginning tomorrow, we're going to move to a 3 to 5 in the afternoon format here on the East, and that'll move it up on the West Coast to an hour earlier as well, which would probably be an advantage to some folks. So with that, let me encourage you to participate actively in the program by using the phone number that we have, and I'll make it available to you. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to email me directly about the program or about the Virtual Center itself, or make comments on previous programs or suggestions on future ones, I would love to hear from you, and I mean that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, IEN, 906, all one word, no punctuation, at gmail.com. And again, the phone number, area code 304-658-3333. Well, I remembered to open with the announcement that we'll be moving to a 3 to 5 format. We'll be an hour earlier during the day, and I think that'll help for a number of reasons. And one reason happened last week, if you recall. I ran right into Bob Kincaid's program, and I didn't mean to do that. I just totally lost track of the time. I mean, I have a computer screen in front of me here, and I'm not going to get into the details, but if I could see it, it would be incredible. My eyesight's not the best, and the computer printing is a little bit small for me, and I kind of have to squint, look over around the microphone in order to see it. So I missed the time totally, and we were at 1 minute after the hour when I realized that I was 1 minute beyond the program. The hour coming an hour earlier will eliminate that danger, and will basically assure Bob that he will have a smooth lead into his program at the 6 o'clock hour here in the East. So that's one advantage, but it's not the major one. I just hate to keep moving the starting times back and forth to try to accommodate my schedule. So we've kind of decided that maybe just permanently moving from 3 will make that easier. I try to recreate. Again, it's been 5 days since we've been together, so I'd like to go back and touch base with where we were before. But before I do that, if you remember, we were looking at the Cleon Skousen's 5,000-year leap and the 28 principles that he felt were the foundation and the basis of what the founders created here in the American Republic. And I wanted to address those because I think they're very significant if for no other reason than a lot of very prominent people buy into them. And I mentioned this, that no less than Glenn Beck made the point that he believes that much of his political ideology is drawn directly from the Skousen book. He says that the book has been most influential in the development of his own political views, and he indeed, when the book was republished in a second edition in 2009, Glenn Beck wrote the foreword. So he basically not only buys into these principles, but he has clearly endorsed them. And I read a couple of quotes of people that question these principles. One of them is the Southern Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which claims that the 5,000-year leap, and this is a quote, is an illustrated recipe for turning the United States into 50 little theocracies, each dictating morality according to its own religious ethics, unquote. So just from the endorsement of Glenn Beck and the quote from the Southern Poverty Law Center, you can begin to get the idea that these 28 principles and this whole issue is extremely controversial, and I would suggest to you it is. Sean Wilentz, who's a prominent historian at Princeton University, has written a number of books and essays and delivered papers at professional conferences, has written a monumental study of the new nation, beginning with the Constitution. Sean Wilentz has the of Cleon Skousen's book, disputing on a number of things. And one of the things that Skousen mentions is that in God we trust, the United States was a motto that was rooted in the founding, when in fact it clearly was not. And so there are a number of controversies surrounding Skousen's book, and I wanted to acknowledge them before we begin. If you remember, last time we were together, we had gone through the first 5 or 6 principles, and I'd like to kind of pick up and review those and then go on. And more important, I'd like to, if I can, spend a little bit of time today addressing what I think is the basis of the controversy between these 28 principles and the alternative interpretation of the founding, which is quite a bit different. Again, it gets into a little bit of philosophy. It's a little bit deep. It's a little bit confusing, but I'll do the best I can. So again, if this is the kind of subject that interests you, I hope that it is, because in terms of the overall mission of the Virtual Center, it seems to me very, very important that we get into these issues and we look at these controversies as to what the Constitution is about. And before our program ends today, I think you'll have a pretty good idea as to why that's true. Not only that, but I think the second step of that is equally important. Why it is absolutely critical that the particular perspective that we are adopting here at the Virtual Center is one that needs to be out there and needs to be addressed and needs to be visibly available in the marketplace of ideas. Because the fact of the matter is, we find ourselves frequently in a situation where those that can scream the loudest and the most often tend to rule the day. And I think in this particular case, that would be a horrendous mistake. Not only for us as students of the founding, but us as citizens of the United States of America and for the future of this republic. So I believe that this is incredibly important. It's one of the key reasons why I wanted to put together something like the Virtual Center in the first place. And more significant than that, it's a basic reason why I wanted to take the virtual center to a network like the Head-On Radio Network, the Horn. Because I want the people to listen to these controversies. The alternative, the way that most people have proceeded in the past, is to take these different positions before groups of scholars, and scholars debate them and discuss them and tear them apart and put them back together again the way they're most comfortable with them and all the rest of it. The point is there is a tremendous gap in communication between the community of scholars, if you wanted to refer to it as that, and the general population of this nation. I personally believe that one of the major flaws that we are living to regret and that we are addressing here at the Virtual Center, in our understanding and appreciation of the founders and the system of government that they created. I believe this very sincerely, is that we have traditionally gone through scholars with the idea that the scholars will massage the information and transpose it or translate it into something that the general population can read, understand, think about, appreciate, know, and support. The fact of the matter is, I think that was a bad choice. I really believe that what we need to do is go directly to the people and present them not only with what the founders are wrestling with and what they are about, but also let them know about these alternative interpretations, most of them that come with their own political agenda. There are, and throughout history this has been true, but there are a number of people out there with a particular agenda or a particular set of goals who have a vested interest in people looking at issues like the Constitution of the United States in particular ways, and more importantly, not looking at them in other ways. Not only does this suggest a lack of faith in the ability of the American people to understand and to think for themselves, but in fact, more often than not, it tends to deny them that possibility, that chance. So my feeling is that what the Virtual Center promises to do is bring the information and bring the evidence to people that have never confronted it before and give them an opportunity to understand it for themselves. In some cases, they're going to agree with what the scholars say. In other cases, they're going to disagree. But I would suggest to you, if you read the founders, that's what the whole idea is supposed to be about. So with that introduction, let's look at Cleon Skousen's 5,000-year leap and the principles, some of the principles that he believed are the basis for the republic as created by the founders. And the first few of these I'm going to go through very quickly because we did spend the last 25 minutes of our program last Wednesday on these. So I don't want to beat the horse to death necessarily. So we'll move these very quickly. One of the things that you will find is that the way this is put together, there is a principle and then there is a quote or a statement. Sometimes a quotation from one of the founders. There are a couple of these quotations from Blackstone in terms of Blackstone's commentary on English common law. They are statements designed not necessarily to clarify the principle, but to basically reinforce it and strengthen a particular interpretation of that principle. That's what we're about here, is to look at the basic principles for ourselves. So the first one, principle number one, the only reliable basis for sound government and just human relations is natural law. That's the principle. And then the statement under it, which is designed to clarify it and to nail down its interpretation, Skousen says the following. Natural law is God's law. There are certain laws which govern the entire universe, and just as Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, there are laws which govern in the affairs of men which are, quote, the law, and of course that quote at the end, the laws of nature and of nature's God, directly from Jefferson's Declaration. So the connection here between natural law and God's law is critical. And I think you'll see that in the principles to follow. But if you recall historically, the so-called Enlightenment in the West, in the early modern period, at the end of the period of the breakdown of the medieval period, the so-called Middle Ages, and the emergence of the modern West. During that transition, the main ideological point of view or theme of the period is usually referred to as the Enlightenment. And there are several names of several philosophers and scholars related to the Enlightenment. One of them is John Locke. And John Locke's treatises on civil government, if you remember, introduce us or acquaint us with the whole idea of the state of nature and the laws of nature, and the emphasis on reason, because the Enlightenment emphasizes man's reason, man's ability to think logically and to understand for himself. And so many people, many historians and people generally have seen the Enlightenment as a challenge to the religious domination of the Middle Ages, the control of the Roman Catholic Church. And of course that control, that universality of the Roman Catholic Church in the Western world, began to break down with the emergence of Martin Luther and what we call the Protestant Reformation. So the universality of the Roman Catholic Church is being challenged, and at the same time, the worldview of the medieval period, the idea that that man's understanding of the world around him is contained in Scripture and contained in the will of God. That is being rejected in the Enlightenment in favor of the idea that man's reason and his common sense, his logic, will cause him to understand. And Locke makes the point, as he connects the Creator to reason, Locke makes the point, I think it's a beautiful statement, that reason is effectively the voice of God within man. So Locke realizes that we're in a transition period here. And this first principle is based on that. So while the Enlightenment oftentimes is seen as a rejection of the Christian worldview in favor of man's reason, his independence and his reason, the fact of the matter is Skousen is very, very interested in linking natural law to God's law. And I think that's very significant, and I think we'll see why. His second principle, a free people cannot survive under a republican constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. A free people cannot survive under a republican constitution unless they remain virtuous and morally strong. The emphasis here, of course, is that in order for a republic to work, to be successful, a republic, a government by the people, in order for that to work, it requires a certain kind of people. It requires a certain definition of citizenship. And the emphasis here is on virtue and on moral strength. And to support that, Skousen goes to what I think is ironic, to Benjamin Franklin. In Benjamin Franklin's comment, quote, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters." So what Franklin's quotation or statement here suggests is that man's freedom is linked directly to his virtue, to his morality. And what Skousen is suggesting is a Republican Constitution can only work if the citizens are virtuous and morally strong. And remember the first principle, that the basis of sound government and just human relations is natural law, which Skousen links to God's law. The third principle, which I think is incredibly important, the most promising method of securing a virtuous people is to select virtuous leaders. And again, I ask you to think about these. The most promising method of securing a virtuous people is to select virtuous leaders. Just that very short statement, it seems to me, is rich with information and meaning. Notice what that statement implies. The most promising method of securing a virtuous people is to select virtuous leaders. One thing that is implied there, it isn't said, but it's clearly there, is that people's virtue is not innate. People are not born virtuous. They learn to be virtuous. And they learn it from their leaders. Very important, because it suggests the need for a top-down kind of political system. Remember, we're talking about a Republican Constitution here. We're talking about a Republican form of government that is based directly on the participation and the involvement of the citizenry, of the masses of the people. Now we're talking about the fact that the virtue of the people depends on the virtue of the leaders. So we're talking about a top-down, not bottom-up, approach not only to virtue, but also to governing. I think that is very, very significant. The most promising method of securing a virtuous people. Again, very important. If you have to secure a virtuous people, that means you don't already have them. Virtue is not there until you put it there. The implication is you're dealing with people who will not become virtuous unless they are taught or forced to do it. Without, revealing the ending here, so to speak, or telling you the end of the story before it's finished. It seems to me very, very significant here, this idea of securing a virtuous people. You are basically buying into the Christian view of mankind as being evil and sinful. The principles here suggest that human nature is evil, that man is not good and man is not virtuous naturally, that he learns it from virtuous leaders. And the question that we need to ask and keep in the background all the time is, where do the leaders get the virtue? If man is born not virtuous, then how is it that the leaders are virtuous enough that they can teach virtue to everybody else? Where do they get their virtue from? Is that an assumption? Let me suggest something else. We're only dealing here with about 8 words. But let me suggest something else. Is the implication here, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm just throwing it out. Is the implication here that these people are virtuous because they're leaders? Or is it because they are leaders because they are virtuous? Think about this. I think this is a really important question. The way you secure virtuous people is to elect virtuous leaders. Well, the first question is, if people are not virtuous by nature, then where do the virtuous leaders come from? And the second question is, are they leaders because they're virtuous, or are they virtuous because they're leaders? And I think that's very significant, that difference. The quote that Skousen uses to support Principle 3 is a quotation from Sam Adams, the Boston radical, who probably was as much as instrumental in initiating the controversy with the mother country as anybody else in the city of Boston. And Sam Adams said this, neither the wisest constitution nor the wisest laws will secure the liberty and happiness of a people whose manners are universally corrupt. He, therefore, is the truest friend to the liberty of his country, who tries most to promote its virtue, and who will not suffer a man to be chosen into any office of power and trust, who is not a wise and virtuous man. Adams is saying what Skousen had said earlier. People whose manners are universally corrupt. Now think about that. If people are universally corrupt, what does that mean? Universally means everybody. But we've just looked at a principle which suggests that the leaders have virtue. Now the question is, when Sam Adams says at the end of his quote, the way to make sure that we don't get into trouble here is to not suffer any man to be chosen into any office of power and trust who is not a wise and virtuous man. Does that suggest that virtue is tied to wisdom? Is virtue the property of the well-educated only? Is what you want when you elect leaders well-educated people, because you can be more certain that the better the education the person has, the more virtuous he'll be? Is that an assumption, do you think, that's safe in making? Would you make that assumption yourself? We've been through 3 of 28 principles, and just think of the number of questions here. Number 4, without religion, the government of a free people cannot be maintained. Now we have a new issue entered into the equation. Religion. It suggests here that this answers a couple of the questions raised earlier. Without religion, the government of a free people cannot be maintained. Now the question is the religion critical for the people being governed, or is religion critical for the leaders who you must look to for virtue? Because the assumption is, if the people are going to be virtuous, it's because their leaders lead them to be virtuous. So now we've introduced religion into this equation. And the question is religion to be the property of the masses, or is religion to be the vehicle to achieve virtue on the part of the leaders who will then teach virtue to the masses? I would suggest to you that that's a key question as well. Skousen goes to no other than George Washington for the quote on the issue of religion. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports, Washington said. And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Washington is suggesting something quite different here. Washington is saying we need to be cautious if we suppose that morality can be maintained without religion. So the virtue that comes from the leaders is going to be maintained, in part at least, through religion. So then one has to ask, what is the connection between religion and political power of the leaders? Are people supposed to believe that leaders are leaders because God put them there? Is that the basis of their leadership? I thought it was virtue. The implication here, however, is that in order to hold the whole thing together and allow Republican government to work, we are talking about a society that must be grounded in religion. It's important for me to say at this point, I'm not raising or disagreeing. I'm not. All I'm trying to do is read what the document says and raise questions about it. Principle number 5. All things were created by God. Therefore, upon him all mankind are equally dependent, and to him they are equally responsible. All things were created by God, and therefore, upon God, all mankind are equally dependent, and to him they are equally responsible. The question that occurs to me as I read principle number 5 is the use of the word equally twice in that sentence. Is the message here that the equality that Jefferson spoke about in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, is this the context of that equality? That they are equal before God, in that they are equally dependent on God, and only to God are they equally responsible. Is that the limit of equality in our society? Does equality mean no more than that? Than the belief that since God made everything, everybody is equally responsible, dependent on God, and everybody is equally responsible to God. Does that enhance society's commitment to equality of its own people, or does it diminish it? If you limit equality to each individual's relationship with his Creator, does that enhance a commitment to equality, or does it diminish? Have you, in effect, have you taken care of the equality issue by putting it in that corner and say equality matters in the relationships with God? We don't have any control over that. Therefore, equality is taken care of. And is it based on that we can move into something suggesting a society where equality seems to be where inequality seems to be a lot more visible than does equality? I don't know. But Principle 6 says specifically, all mankind were created equal. And then Skousen said, the founders knew that in these three ways all mankind are theoretically treated as equal before God, equal before the law, equal in their rights. So that answers the questions posed in principle number 5. All mankind are created equal. And the implication is that that equality focuses first on equality before God and equality before the law and equality in their rights if, let me emphasize if you assume that the law and man's rights are linked to that same God. In other words, it seems to me that in order to accept carte blanche each of these first group of principles, you've got to be willing to accept a few assumptions. The assumptions are that our government is based on the principle of natural law, but very quickly, very early in the game, natural law is equated with God's law. And the only way that a republican form of government can work is if the people are morally strong and virtuous. And their morality and virtue comes from their leaders. And the basis of that morality and virtue in society is the extent to which society is grounded in religion. So what you have here is not an example of the Enlightenment rejection of the worldview of the medieval Europe, the worldview of an age dominated by Christianity, by religion. But what you have here is an effort to link the new to the old, to link the Enlightenment, natural law, and man's reason to the need for virtue and the links between virtue and religion. And then to suggest that the equality that we talk about in this republic is tied directly to the links to God. Mankind are created equal, but that has been introduced with the idea that we are all equally dependent upon and equally responsible to God. And so therefore, when you establish the principle that all mankind are created equal, you elaborate on that by saying men are equal, mankind are theoretically treated as equal before God, equal before the law, and equal in their rights. And the implication is, do these three enhance equality, but more important, enhance society's commitment to equality? Or are they related to something that really doesn't exist in man's day-to-day life? The kind of equality that these principles are talking about is an equality before God. And if you assume that our laws are, in effect, God's laws, then you can say everybody's equal before the law. And since all rights come from God, then we are all equal in our rights as well. And again, I think the key question is, does that enhance our commitment to equality, or does it in effect diminish it? I think that's very, very important. The seventh principle in Skousen's list: the proper role of government is to protect equal rights, not to provide equal things. Very, very important. The proper role of government is to protect equal rights, not provide equal things. I would suggest to you that principle number 7 is effectively a rationalization for inequality. Equality has been taken care of in principles 5 and 6. That relates to God and the laws that God created and the rights that God gave man when he was born. But now we're talking about government and society in his day-to-day life. And now we're saying the proper role of government is to protect man's equal rights before God, before the law, but not provide equal things. The implication clearly here is, don't look at who people are or where they live or what they have or what they own or what they're worth. Equality only goes as far as each of us in our relationships to God, the law, and the rights that we derived from God. I would suggest to you that principle 7 is a qualification of 5 and 6. Principle 7, it seems to me, suggests the nature of society, a society where the commitment to equality as articulated in the Declaration of Independence is being qualified. This is my reading, but please believe me, this is all interpretive. The only thing I've got before me here is the document itself, and I'm reading that to you. Under principle number 7, Skousen says, the founders recognized that the people cannot delegate to their government any power except that which they have the lawful right to exercise themselves. Think about that. The people cannot give government more power than the people have the right to exercise themselves. So if the people are limited in their power, then that means their government must be limited in its power as well, the government that they create. And this is where we stopped last week. This is where I marked principle number 8. Mankind are endowed by God with certain unalienable rights. And of course, that's what Jefferson said in the Declaration. And now, Skousen is going to quote Blackstone from his commentaries, William Blackstone. Those rights then, this is all Blackstone, those rights then which God and nature have established and are therefore called natural rights, such as are life and liberty, need not the aid of human laws to be more effectually invested in every man than they are. Neither do they receive any additional strength when declared by the municipal or state laws to be inviolable. On the contrary, no human legislation has power to abridge or destroy them, unless the owner of the right shall himself commit some act that amounts to a forfeiture. So says William Blackstone. This is an effort to limit the power of government. Principle number 7 talks about the fact that equality relates to rights, not results, not equal things. Now the principles are that mankind are given certain rights, endowed by God with certain rights. These rights, which God and nature have established, says Blackstone, are called natural rights. They are life and liberty. This is important. and they don't need the aid of human laws to be more effectually invested in every man than they are. Translation: government has no right to do anything in an effort to enhance the position of people in society in relation to other people in society. Government does not have the power to interfere with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. That means that government does not have the right to take from some and give it to others. Government does not have the authority to manage the entire society in the interests of consensus, community, harmony, and peace. Government's primary responsibility is to the individual and the rights of the individual. Government has no right to sacrifice in any way the rights of an individual in order to meet its responsibilities to govern the community as a whole. Growing up in grade school, we learned that this was the principle of limited government, and this is one of the strengths of American society. But what we are reading here is a principle which basically suggests what government's limited power really means. What Skousen is saying in principle number 8 is that it is very important that we not allow government to govern, except to protect the rights which God gave every man, and the rights to guarantee that every man is treated equally before the law, which is modeled on God's law. But in effect here, what Skousen is doing is suggesting that government's power to govern does not extend far enough to govern. It is limited by God's plan. It is grounded in religion. And so, in a sense, what Skousen is saying is that no aid, nobody has a right to the aid of human laws to be more effectually invested in every man than they are. You are what you are. You have no right to look to government to improve your standing. So all of these things we hear all the time about safety nets and the right to health care and the right to education and the right to a roof over your head and the right to a job and all of these other things, what this principle suggests is that government has no right to do to provide those things or to address those things, because the only way government can do it would be to take the resources from those who have it in order to transfer them to those who don't. And I would suggest to you, in today's world, liberals believe that that's government's number one priority, is to govern in such a way that there is relative equality in society, and so that society can be much more harmonious and much more peaceful and much more together, if you will. But this principle, or these principles altogether, suggest that the priority needs to be that what you do in this world is not directly related to the way you came into this world as God's creation. We are all equally dependent on God. We are all equally responsible to God, but that's a separate issue. And government does not have the right to take those ideas of equality and try to bring them into the day-to-day lives that people live. That's what Skousen means by equality. I've got to ask you, is that what Jefferson meant by equality? I don't think so. I think it's very significant that Jefferson put equality ahead of the inalienable rights to life, liberty. And the question that we all have to ask is Jefferson looking at equality in the same context, in the same way that Skousen is? And do the inalienable rights really become paramount over the equality? Is equality something that totally exists in a different context than the rights to life, liberty, and property? And then again, this is the quote from Blackstone, which elaborates on this principle. Nor do they have a right to receive any additional strength when declared by the municipal laws or state laws to be inviolable. In other words, there's nothing that man can do by making laws which change this equation. On the contrary, he said, no human legislation has power to abridge or destroy them unless the owner shall commit some act that amounts to a forfeiture. In other words, if you commit a murder or something and society takes away your freedom or extinguishes your life with the death penalty, that's something different. But that's the only conditions, those are the only conditions under which government has a right with you as an individual or your individual rights. And then under Principle 9, Skousen says, to protect human rights, God has revealed a code of divine law. Back to Blackstone. The doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures. These precepts, when revealed, are found by comparison to be really a part of the original law of nature, as they tend in all their consequences to man's felicity. So here is Skousen's effort to link man's law to God's law. And what Skousen has done in the previous principles is limit God's law to a particular context. And what Skousen is suggesting is that God's divine law speaks to that very same definition, that man's equality only extends to his dependence upon God and his responsibility to God and the need to obey laws, because the implication is that man's law is inspired by God's divine law. Principle number 10, the God-given right to govern is vested in the sovereign authority of the whole people. Madison. The God-given right to govern is vested in the sovereign authority of the whole people. No portion of it, but the whole people. It is the people as an entity that is the source of the right to govern. What that means is the majority of the people doesn't have a right to govern, because what about the minority? So if the right to govern is vested in the authority of the whole people, then the question is, who speaks for the whole people? And the answer to that is their leaders, who are the only ones that possess the virtue to do that. So what we are looking at here is a set of principles that basically justify a top-down natural aristocracy type of situation in this country where certain people are deemed to be more worthy of having political power than other people. In fact, it's made very clear that the average people don't have the kind of virtue that the leaders have. And part of the role of leadership is to disseminate that virtue, that commitment to right and wrong, to the people as a whole, because they don't have it. They're not born with it. If they're going to get it, they're going to get it because somebody teaches it to them. And if somebody teaches it to them, where is the curriculum going to come from? Scripture. Because God's divine law is the model for man's law under this scheme of things. And so the implication is this, if you think about it, up to this point in these principles, this is not what Skousen is suggesting here. This is seek to create. What Skousen is suggesting, this is the system that the founders did create. So the only option that you have as a citizen, that I have as a citizen, is to accept this as being the explanation for what it's all about and how it all makes sense. This is a rationalization for a society that is potentially much more unequal in the way people live their day-to-day lives than many of us are comfortable with. But this is a set of principles which is designed to explain and rationalize that, and suggest that equality must be looked at only within certain limitations, that Republican government can only work with a virtuous people, and the only place that people can get their virtue is from their leaders, and the only place that all of this virtue comes from is as much as possible to model your society after God's divine law. And the implication is people with no virtue aren't going to do that. They can't do it. So therefore it has to be your leaders who do it, because they're the only ones that have enough virtue to do it. I mean, when you put all of this together, it's pretty astounding. And by saying in principle number 10 that the God-given right to govern is vested in the sovereign authority of the whole people, then what that is suggesting is that the justification for government's very existence is the decision by the whole people to consent to be governed. Not just a minority, not just a majority, not just those who vote, but the power of government to exist comes from the authority of the whole people. It is very important to relate this to Madison's Federalist number 10, when Madison said that the Constitution of the United States will not be ratified by the people of each state, but it will be ratified by the people in each state. But what you are creating by doing this is the idea that the final product, which is ratification of the Constitution, was completed by the whole people, not just a portion of it. What you are suggesting here is that government's power comes from the people. Yes, we've all learned that. But the meaning of that is that no one group of the people can challenge that. When the South secedes from the Union, it is, according to Abraham Lincoln, rebellion. It is a rebellion against the will of the sovereign authority of the whole people by a group of the people. This is very, very important. And this is a quote from Alexander Hamilton to support principle number 10 on the sovereign authority of the whole people. The fabric of American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people. The streams of national power ought to flow immediately from that pure original fountain of all legislative authority. It comes from the whole people. Now we know, Madison told us in Federalist number 10, that the whole people are not going to agree on anything because factions are sown into the nature of man. That means that the whole people cannot define what the whole people want. Only those that the people elect can. What we have here is a very, very intricate process where the power to define the public interest is being defined not by the public itself, but by the people that the public elects to represent them. Remember, Madison said in Federalist number 10, the public interest as defined by the representatives of the people might, in fact, be closer to the ideal of the public interest than if pronounced by the people themselves. What this principle does is justify the transfer of power from the people to the government. And it's very, very important to understand that. And then, principle number 11, which is Jefferson's declaration again, the majority of the people may alter or abolish a government which has become tyrannical. The majority of the people may alter or abolish. That's the right of revolution. And the rationalization for that is Jefferson's statement in the Declaration. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. That's taken directly from Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So the people have the right to abolish government. But the question is, who speaks for the people, since the one before suggested that the people can't really speak for themselves? And I would suggest to you that that is a good stopping place. That's the first 10, actually 11 principles, 11 principles of Skousen's piece. When we come back after a 5-minute break, I'd like to address. I'll get back and maybe in a future program and look at the other principles. But I want to get into what's going on here in our second hour today. As I mentioned at the beginning of the program, I hope, even though there's some philosophy associated with it, I hope that I can try to bring a little bit of sense and understanding and explanation to essentially what's happening here. So I'd like to do that in our second hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break. This is Bill O'Brien. This is the Virtual Center for the Study of the United States Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I thank you for being with us, and in 5 minutes we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you. This is Bill O'Brien, and if you've been with us since the top of the hour, thank you so very much for staying with us. If you're just joining us, welcome. Welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center. I am Bill O'Brien. It is a pleasure to be with you today. If you were with us last Wednesday, you remember that at the end of the program, excuse me, in about the last 15 to 20 minutes, we were looking at some of the principles on which Cleon Skousen argued in his book called The 5,000-Year Leap, that the American founding, that the American Republic is based upon, kind of the 28 principles that explain what we're about as a nation. Now that's probably the best way to explain it, that according to Skousen, these are the principles which, when you understand them and you look at them and you combine them, this is really what America is all about, is what Skousen is arguing. Obviously, we went through the first 11 principles in our first hour today. We looked at a couple last Wednesday. We went through the first 11 today. And what I tried to do was just read the principle along with the quotation to justify it, and then basically to try to deal with it with a little bit, as much as I can bring, a little bit of what I know about the founding and about the period to the table, so to speak. And what I'm left with is a number of questions, very, very troublesome questions. And those questions are the issues that I want to make the focus of our second hour today. I encourage you to participate actively in our program. This stuff is extremely important. This is really what the Virtual Center in its inception is all about. Because it is my sense that the vast majority of the folks out there have never been exposed to these kinds of issues. And it is my strong belief that they aren't supposed to be. I believe that this gets into the whole issue of education, which we'll, I'm sure, return to again, because the way we educate our citizens in a republic is incredibly important to the kind of republic we want. What we are seeing in Skousen's principles is a very clear definition of the kind of republic that he wants, the kind of republic that Glenn Beck wants. A republic which is based on a set of assumptions which are linked directly to religion. When these people talk about America being a Christian nation, this is what they talk about. This is what they mean. They mean that the average person has no virtue. And what virtue the people have is going to come from their leaders, from the leaders they elect. And so if you put these principles together, you begin to get a very clear picture of who leads and who follows, who's virtuous and who isn't. You begin to see a couple of the principles which address what Jefferson addressed at the front end of the Declaration of Independence, equality in this society. And a very, very clear explanation, not so much as to what equality means, but what equality doesn't mean. Equality means dependence upon and responsibility to God and to the laws which God inspired and to the rights which God gave man. But that's all. Principle number 7 said that the role of government is to protect equal rights, not provide equal things. And then it goes on in Principles 8 to explain clearly what we mean by government's limited power. Government does not have the right to interfere with the successes that man has experienced in this life. Government does not have the right to govern in such a way that it can do anything to alter the results of the principal individual freedom and liberty that God gave it, and God gave us, and God created. I had said that we could hold these later principles for later, but let me just, I'm not going to go through all of them, but let me just read you 4 or 5 of the principles to come. We went through 11. Number 12 is that the United States of America shall be a republic. We've talked about that on previous programs. A constitution should protect the people from the frailties of their rulers. Now, that's kind of a contradiction if you think about it, because theoretically, the rulers are the ones with the virtue. But I guess what you do is you define their virtue according to the degree to which they abide by the other principles. And if they try to move away from them, then they become frailties. Let me try these 2 principles on you. Principle number 14. Life and liberty are secure only so long as the rights of property are secure. Where do you think that they go to get rationalization or justification for that? John Locke. John Locke reasoned that God gave the earth and everything in it to the whole human family as a gift. Therefore, the land, the sea, the acorns in the forest, the deer feeding in the meadow belong to everyone in common. However, the moment someone takes the trouble to change everything from its original state of nature, that person has added his ingenuity or labor to make that change. Herein lies the secret to the origin of property rights. So number 14 is that life and liberty are secure only as long as the rights of property are secure. And number 15, I think all of us will be able to relate to, the highest level of prosperity occurs when there is a free market economy and a minimum of government regulations. And then 16, the government should be separated into 3 branches. In other words, the way you set up the government, the way you organize the government, relates directly to the idea of the free market economy and the minimum of government regulations by setting up 3 branches. So basically, what we are left with here, it seems to me, what we are confronted with, is a picture of principles, when you put them all together, which suggests that the free market economy and the kind of tax laws we have and the limitations on the ability of government to govern and the dependency of people on the virtue of their leaders, and all of these things pretty well rationalize a society which justifies an ideal for the few but not the many. I think that's what we're looking at. I think that's the conclusion that these principles lead us to. And I really, and I mean this sincerely, I really respect and request and solicit your input and your reaction to this, because this is pretty powerful stuff. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Our phone number here at the Horn, area code 304-658-3333. It is important that you think about these things and you make yourself heard, because there are other people out there who need to hear what you think. Because the fact of the matter is, you're listening to this program and you're listening to the Horn. By definition, you do think. You're not listening to a program like this or a program like Bob Kincaid's in the evening because you're looking to be entertained. You can be entertained in a lot of places, but the Head On Radio Network is not one of them. The purpose of the Head On Radio Network and the purpose of the Virtual Center is to promote dialogue and conversation for the benefit of all of us. I would suggest to you that the principles we've been looking at today are not designed to promote communication and conversation. They are designed to stifle it. They are designed to reinforce the idea that the average person is incapable of contributing anything meaningful or substantive to this discussion. And that what most citizens can do and should appreciate the opportunity to do is listen as those who have natural ability to understand better explain to them what the situation is and why it is this way. I would suggest to you that the Head On Radio Network exists in direct opposition to those principles, as does the Virtual Center. And I think it is incredibly important that people appreciate this. So where does this all come from? This is the philosophical stuff I mentioned at the beginning. Needed a sip of coffee on that one. Where does this all come from? What's the origin of this? I thought we had a republic. I thought the model for republican government lies in the ancients, in Athenian democracy, and in the Roman Republic. We have the writings of Plato, who in his Republic raised serious questions about democracy, about Athenian democracy, and made a very, very strong case in his Republic for the idea that only the few are really qualified to rule in the public interest. And what society needed to do was cultivate its leaders by educating people to be what he called, the right people to be what he called his philosopher kings. Certain people were born to make the rules and certain people were born to follow them. And his argument, Plato's argument, was you need to set it up that way. And if you try to confound that, if you try to mess around with that equation, as the Athenians tried to do with their effort at democracy, where people went into the square and debated issues and talked and dialogued and all the rest of it, you just create chaos. So we have a republic. We have models for a republic. We have Plato, we have Aristotle, we have the other ancients, we have the Roman Republic, we have Solon, and we have Tacitus, and we have Cicero, and we have some of the other major Latin classical scholars, if you will, and thinkers. And so in theory, if the founders are creating a republic here in America, then you naturally go back to the classics for your information and for your models. But I would suggest to you there's a problem there. And the problem exists in the idea that the republics created were based on the idea that government's responsibility was to govern the whole society in the interest of all of its people, not just protect the rights of a few of its people against the best interests of the rest of its people, if that makes sense. I would suggest to you that those like Cleon Skousen and Glenn Beck and some of the other people that endorse the kinds of principles we've been looking at have a problem with going back to the classics, to ancient republics. Aristotle made the very famous statement that man is a political animal. The basic premise of the ancients in setting up their government was that man's very existence is dependent on the community he lives in. The government of the community, in Greece it was the polis, the city-state. It was an independent political entity, and government's responsibility was to govern it in the best interests of all of the people. And the idea is that individual people couldn't reach their potential except within the context of the polis, in the context of the community. What people are and what they become is directly dependent on the nature of the political system they exist in. So when Aristotle talks about man being a political animal, he's talking about something very, very, very important. Politics is the very basis of fulfilling human potential. And the ancients referred to it as the ancient science of politics. Let me suggest to you that those who endorsed the principles that we've been looking at here, as articulated by Cleon Skousen, run into a real problem when they look at the ancient science of politics. Because the ancient science of politics and Plato suggests emphasis on the group and the public interest, not self-interest and private interest. Something has to happen in the translation. If you are going to assign the founders, America's founders, as being directly related to and dependent upon the classics, the ancient science of politics, then you're talking about a government that is putting the public interest first, always ahead of self-interest. You're talking about a government that is based on the idea that man cannot fulfill himself unless he lives in a political climate which is committed to and organized to fulfill that potential for every human being in it. What we have today, and by today I just don't mean in the year 2013, I'm talking about in the last 25 to 30 years, we have a whole school of scholars who are basically committed to the idea of downplaying the link between the founders and the ancients because of the contradiction that I've just pointed out. Because if the emphasis is on politics, the emphasis is on the entire political community. And if you want a different definition for the role of government, you need to go somewhere else to find it. You're not going to find it in you're not going to find it in the ancients, because Plato, Aristotle, and the rest of them didn't look at politics that way. I want to share with you a paragraph from a political scientist named Alan Gibson. Alan Gibson has written 2 books, which I think are superb. The first one is entitled Interpreting the Founding, a guide to the enduring debates over the origins and foundations of the American Republic. The second book, which is much more extensive and elaborate than the first, is called Understanding the Founding, the Crucial Questions. Here's what Alan Gibson talks about when he talks about the ancients and the way they looked at politics. According to Alan Gibson, the ancients accorded primacy to politics. Viewing man as a political animal, they believed that individuals could fully develop their humanness only by exercising their capacities for speech and cooperative action about questions concerning the advantageous and the good. Here, the polis, the political unit, was central because it provided citizens with a middle ground for engaging in public deliberation to, and this is a quote, to weigh and determine what is measured, fitting, timely, needful, and the like, and for seeking office, power, and glory, and thus displaying those qualities which distinguish them from animals. The basic principle there is that in order for man to discover and develop his own humanity, his existence as the member of a political community had to be emphasized. His individualism had to be minimized and downplayed. His commitment to community had to be emphasized and supported. Because only within community, only within the proper set of priorities, could man's humanity flourish. And that's what the ancients looked for. The primacy given to politics, says Gibson, was a double-edged sword. Deliberation could foster political solidarity and cooperative action, bring citizens to agreement about what's just and advantageous, and open up a forum for citizens to pursue immortal glory and thus display their transcendence of mere life. Nevertheless, it also inevitably produced factions within the community and wars between one community and other communities. By definition, the focus on community and the polis ended up leading to wars between one polis and another polis, the most famous one being the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Greece. Between Athens and Sparta, rather. Greece. Athens and Sparta. And the irony of the situation, when you look at Athenian democracy, the epitome, the absolute model of what the ancients looked at when they looked at the polis was Sparta. The military society, which was the Spartan society. Many of us have heard of the use of the adjective Spartan. Spartans mean when somebody says Spartan, they're talking about rigid control, rigid rules, follow the rules, never veer from them, a very top-down, totally controlled community where the decisions are being made and people's emphasis is always focused on the best interests of the entire community. And the result from this emphasis, Gibson points out, more often than not, was war. As much as all the positive human qualities that are associated with this idea of politics being the emphasis. So as Gibson points out, I'm going to read one more paragraph from Gibson. The principal goals of ancient communities were therefore to prepare for war, suppress faction, and radically subordinate the individual to the needs of the community. These goals led to the formation within ancient polis, of comprehensive sets of laws and customs that promoted harmony and educated the citizenry to the community's particular way of life, fostered religious belief, and inculcated awe and fear of the gods in the citizenry, and limited commerce, money-making, and technological innovation because these activities were thought to multiply the interests of the community and eviscerate public spiritedness. This is a sentence from Gibson, and it's very complicated. Let me read it again if I can. The principal goals of ancient communities, then, were to prepare for war, suppress factions, and radically subordinate the individual to the needs of the whole community. This led to the formation within each individual polis of comprehensive sets of laws and customs that promoted harmony within the community and educated citizens to the community's particular way of life. Fostered religious beliefs and inculcated fear and awe of the gods within citizens. And this is important. And limited commerce, money-making, and technological innovation, because these activities were thought to multiply the interests of the community and eviscerate public spiritedness. The problems with commerce, money-making, and technological innovation were that they fed self-interest at the expense of the public interest. So they were discouraged. Capitalism, as we know it, was discouraged. All the things that make up capitalism and self-interest were discouraged because all of them created discord and division within society. So let me pause here and just point out something. When Madison says that factions are sown in the nature of man, how does this relate to the ancient societies, to the classical societies of Greece and Rome? Are factions sown into the nature of man? It was commerce and money-making and technological innovation that these people believed created factions. So therefore, by discouraging these things, you minimize the emergence of factions and discord within your society, and you made society easier to govern. Because all people tended to agree on the same kinds of important things. This was the basis of the classics. Those who are advocating the principles that Cleon Skousen is talking about, Principle 15, the highest priority, the highest level of prosperity occurs when there is a free market economy and minimum government regulation. That's the kind of society that flies in the face of what the ancients wanted. So what that means is the Skousens and the Glenn Becks and the rest of them don't want the founders, America's founders, connected to the ancients. Because the ancients' emphasis on politics and governing the community ran counter to the kind of society that these people want, that these people believe America ought to be. And that's what these people believed that the founders intended our society to not be. Back to Allen Gibson. Beginning in the 16th century and accelerating throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, a whole new group of thinkers began to become preeminent. Machiavelli, Bacon, Montaigne, Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Harrington, and the radical Whigs of the 17th and 18th century in England. This group began to articulate the philosophies of individualism. They were the products of the Protestant Reformation. They were the products of the Enlightenment. And they began to emphasize the priority of the individual over the priorities of the entire community. Thus, these are the people that Cleon Skousen and Glenn Beck and those who would advocate an individualistic, self-interested society, these were the people that had to connect the founders not to Plato and Aristotle and the ancients, but to Locke and Hobbes and Descartes and Machiavelli and Bacon and Harrington and the radical Whigs of the 17th and 18th century. The radical Whigs of the 18th century are best exemplified in the collection of letters referred to as the Cato letters, C-A-T-O. The Cato letters were a series of, I believe, 43, I'm guessing 43, I can't really remember the exact number, I think it was 43 letters that were published in the newspapers of England, criticizing the government and the absolute power of the king, and advocating limited government in Great Britain, advocating individual rights, advocating individual freedom, advocating the rights to private property, and the responsibility of government to protect that property. These were the philosophers of the early modern period that the founders read, as well as the ancients. So the question is, which group did the founders take their marching orders from? Was it a mixture of them both? Did they take some from the ancients and some from the more modern political philosophers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries? Where did the transition happen where the emphasis on the community was pushed toward the back burner and replaced by an emphasis on individualism, on freedom? And then the idea that this was God's plan. If you look at England in the 17th century, what you find is that the major supporters of limiting the power of government and enhancing the power of Parliament against the divine right of kings, the main supporters in society for that change was coming from the emergent middle and commercial classes of Great Britain, of London and some of the other major seaports of Great Britain. What you had in English politics in the 17th century, 1600s, was a split, a political split between the forces of the free enterprise capitalist future and the landed nobility of the medieval past. The divine right of kings, the absolute power of the kings and the landed nobility that supported the king, was adhering to the priorities of governing the entire community and discouraging individualism and discouraging self-interest in favor of public interest. The group of people that had the greatest interest in challenging the absolute power of the king, the divine right of kings, was the emergent middle class in British politics. The bankers and the merchants and the shippers and the insurance people and the builders, all of those who were primed to make England a dominant power in the face of the earth, because England would control the seas. But in order to control the seas, You had to break the absolute power of government. You had to find a way to justify the right of the middle class moneymakers and investors to dominate society. And in British politics, it is this middle commercial class that gains control of Parliament. And the civil wars that govern or characterize English politics in the 18th century, the civil wars which lead to the beheading of Charles I in 1649, which lead to a military regime controlled by Parliament under the person of Oliver Cromwell. This is the emergence of the middle class, what we call today the business community, asserting its right to control British politics. And in 1660, the king is brought back to the throne of Great Britain. England has gone without a king from 1649 to 1660 for 11 years. And it has produced military dictatorship within England. And those who believe in the Magna Carta and all of these other ideas of rights and freedoms and all the rest of it that British citizens have been used to, England is on the verge of chaos. And in order to stem that chaos and reestablish security and stability in England, Charles II is crowned King of England in 1660 in what is called the Restoration, which is the restoring of the crown to an England that has not had a king for 11 years. But Charles II has a whole new set of challenges to deal with that Charles I didn't. Because he's got an aggressive parliament controlled by an aggressive middle and commercial class in England. So the only way that he can effectively govern is to work with the business community, which Charles I was unwilling to do. This is the period in British history when the so-called Navigation Acts are passed. This is the period when the British government decides that it's going to basically maximize the wealth of the American colonies. This is the period when the American colonies, who've been pretty much allowed to go their own way and do their own thing with no control of England, this is the period when the colonies are going to be reined in for the benefit of England. This is the period when the British Empire, as we know it in history, is born. This is the period when Great Britain will dominate and rule the seas. Problem is that Charles II is replaced by James II in 1688. James II is a Catholic. James II has to go. The crowning of James II as King of England in 1688 is the signal for what we know in history as the Glorious Revolution. James II is driven from England, and the crown is offered to William of Orange and his wife Mary. The difference is that they come back and assume the crown as King and Queen of England under the terms established by Parliament. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 is the establishment of parliamentary rule in Great Britain, which effectively means it's the beginning of the end for the landed nobility in British politics, and it's the emergence of the commercial financial sector of the British economy in dictating and controlling the policies of Great Britain. The English Bill of Rights of 1689, which establishes the right to free speech and the right of Parliament to rule and the King to submit to the will of Parliament. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 does not represent or speak to the rights of the individual citizens of Great Britain. It speaks only to the rights of Parliament, which represents the business community in England during this period. John Locke's treatise on civil government in 1688 is written to justify the limited government that happens in England in 1688 and 1689. John Locke's treatise on civil government, his whole approach towards the state of nature and natural rights and all of this, is designed to limit the power of government over the community in England, which allows the middle classes and the business community to prevail and flourish and dictate policy in Great Britain into the 18th century. And of course, as we know, the 18th century is going to ultimately lead in 1776 to the Declaration of Independence of the American colonies. The point I'm trying to make is that in order to justify this transition, the reliance on the ancient definition of republican government had to change. The ingredients of republicanism had to change. The ingredients of republican government had to change. And so what has happened is that the Enlightenment ideas, the pre-modern ideas of the Montesquieux and Locke and Hobbes and Descartes and Harrington and all the rest of them, are replacing the emphasis on politics of Aristotle and Plato from the ancients. And Alan Gibson speaks to what he calls a new science of politics. This new science of politics, Gibson says, shows that the early moderns developed what was predicated on radically different beliefs from classical republicanism and sought to achieve radically different ends, whereas the ancients had believed with Aristotle that man is a political animal who is either a beast or a god outside a moral community. The moderns envisioned a fictitious pre-political state of nature in which man in his essence was free, equal, independent, and dominated by a concern for self-preservation and material comfort, the ingredients of free enterprise capitalism. This is the point at which Cleon Skousen, Glenn Beck, and others, this is the point that they have to connect the founders to, not Plato and Aristotle. And so in one of the most, I think, the most incredible sentences in this book by Alan Gibson, he's talking about this new group of scholars. He calls them Lockean or neoliberals. And he says the following: they share one central methodological principle. Even if they disagree among themselves on details, they share one central methodological principle. They meticulously study texts in search of the transhistorical and philosophical teachings embedded within them. What is he saying? He's talking about the Glenn Becks, and he's talking about the Cleon Skousens. And he's talking about the conservative scholars who are putting out the conservative literature today to justify the Tea Party and the limits on government and the shutdown and the limitations on the deficit and the possibility that the government may actually default on debt, all of it. Those who advocate it are justifying their positions from this scholarship. And what Alan Gibson points out is that these scholars agree on one thing. They meticulously study texts, the primary sources, in search of trans-historical and philosophical teachings. Trans-historical is an interesting word because it means that they do not limit themselves to the historical evidence. They look for evidence within the historical evidence which will justify the point of view that they want to put forth. They meticulously study texts in search of the trans-historical and philosophical teachings embedded within them. This methodological principle is synergistic with what they call thinking revolutionaries. What Alan Gibson points out is that these people have an agenda. Their agenda is to break the connection between the founders and the ancients because of the ancients' emphasis on the political community, and instead to link the founders to the 16th century anti-absolute government ideology of Cato's letters, the philosophy of the philosophy of the Locke's and the Machiavellis and the rest of it. And so the scholarship that is coming out is designed to minimize the links between the founders and the ancients and to emphasize the links between the founders and the ideology of the 17th century which produced the Glorious Revolution. Because this justifies free enterprise capitalism, this justifies an emphasis on individualism and individual freedom and materialism, and most important, this emphasizes the right to limit government and minimize its role in managing the society as a whole. It is philosophically complex. It is politically astounding. It is something that all of us must know and all of us must appreciate, and it probably has raised as many questions in your mind as it has answered. I'll do the best I can in future programs. I'll begin tomorrow. I'll do the best I can in future programs to try to explain in a little bit more detail what's going on. This may be the most important particular program that we've done here at the Virtual Center up to now. It is 58, almost 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for listening to the Head On Radio Network. I want to thank you for your willingness to support the Head On Radio Network with your dollars. It is absolutely vital that we keep this voice in the marketplace. And for that, I thank you so very, very much. And I thank you for putting up with me and for the Virtual Center. I believe as well this is a very, very important issue. We have got to make sure that it stays out there. I'm Bill O'Brien. Please enjoy your evening. Be safe, because we sure want everybody to be able to come back and join us again. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Good day.